Good morning, everyone. I'm Kendall Stegman, the Air Quality Division Director. Welcome, everyone, to the Air Quality Virtual Workshop. We are excited to have everybody today. Looks like we have over 220 folks online, which is very exciting. So welcome to our first all air quality workshop, first one we've had in 6 years. As most of you know, we usually have an emissions inventory workshop annually, but since we haven't had an all air quality workshop, we thought we would do one this year because we have lots of good updates for you. We will be getting legal updates, permits, compliance, and of course, emissions inventory. Here's today's agenda. It's very robust, lots of great information for you. We'll talk about federal rule updates, our new permitting rules. We will be telling you about our e-permitting retirement, the new oil and gas general permit, tanks tool demo and updates, talk about our compliance monitoring strategy, our interpretation of annual for purposes of NSPS and NESHAP, and of course, our emission inventory updates. And it's just a reminder, remember, air quality rules always apply. No matter what you hear today, if we say something off that's against, not part of our air quality rules, remember, air quality rules always apply. Now, as you know, this is a crazy time. We're still part of a pandemic. However, we have not missed a beat. We have gone into full-blown teleworking status. Then we went into more of a permanent teleworking status. We are able to get everybody on mobile devices to be able to complete their work. So we are writing permits. We are doing our emission inventories. We're doing rulemakings. And of course, we are doing our inspections. These crazy times has not hampered our work one bit. And we are still trying to meet our goals and protecting the human health and the environment in the state of Oklahoma. Now, thanks for coming. If you have any questions, please use that link below, the DEQ contacts. And now over to our moderator, Christina, for some insights before we get into the presentations. It's off to you, Christina.
Thank you, Kendall. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Christina Hagens, and I will be your moderator for today. So we're going to go over just a few house rules. So we are on Zoom right now, and you should all be muted right now. And you should not also have access to turn on your webcam just to keep any kind of noise down while we have our presenters going. You are able to change your name. So if your display name is showing up as your email or employee ID or anything like that, you should be able to click on it and update it just for our purposes, because if you have a question, I'll call on you and I want to make sure I am calling you by your name. You should see that we are recording this workshop and we will be posting it to the emissions inventory workshop page on our website, which is where you should have registered. And if you ever lose connectivity, just try to rejoin. You should be able to hop back on if it's kicking you off. And if anything happens on our end, we will continue to reestablish that connection for 15 minutes and restart the meeting as quick as we can. And if that happens, you will also have to rejoin. So when we get to questions, which we'll leave room for questions after each presenter, if you wish to speak, you can raise your hand. So this function can be found in different places, whether you're on your computer or on a mobile device. So if you're on a computer, it's under Reactions, and you'll see Raise Hand. If you're on mobile, it's under More, and then there's that pop-up. If you don't wish to raise your hand or talk, you can just type a question in the chat box, and then I will read that question aloud for the presenter to answer. And again, on the mobile, if view under more is where you will see where the chat is available. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Madison Miller, our air quality attorney, for some federal rule updates.
Okay, let me get my screen shared. All right. So just to make sure, Christina, can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So hello, good morning. My name is Madison Miller. I'm the supervising attorney for the Air Quality Division at DEQ. So today, I wanted to touch on some hot topics that are going on at the federal level. I just want to discuss the status of some of these issues in air quality. In air, there can be so much going on nationally that it's hard to keep track on the regulatory side of things and the litigation over those regulations. So I just wanted to lay out the status, and then this is my roadmap. So the oil and natural gas methane rule is something I'm going to discuss. Greenhouse gas litigation over greenhouse gas regulations from power plants, and startup shutdown malfunction. There's some things going on with that. Regional haze, we're in the middle of the round 2 planning period for regional haze, so I'll give kind of a brief overview of Oklahoma's status. And the NAAQS periodic reviews, there are some things happening with that. The last bullet point is not actual federal rulemaking. It's dealing with state level rulemaking, but there are some interesting things. We had an Air Quality Advisory Council meeting last week, and so I just wanted to give a brief status update on that. So going straight into the oil and natural gas methane proposed rule. So on November 15th of 2021, so just a couple months ago, EPA proposed what's called Standards of Performance for New, Reconstructed, and Modified Sources and Emissions Guidelines for Existing Sources, Oil and Natural Gas Sector Climate Review, otherwise known as the Oil and Natural Gas Methane Rule at DEQ anyway. I wanted to briefly discuss what EPA is proposing to do with this rule. So as the rule exists today, EPA regulates oil and gas source categories through 40 CFR Part 60 subparts Quad O and Quad OA. So anybody unfamiliar with oil and gas rules, Quad O is just shorthand for saying 4O in the NSPS and 4OA. So we call it Quad O. So there's some history involved to understand the first bullet point I have here regarding EPA reinstating certain provisions of Quad O and Quad OA. If you see on the slide where I discuss big takeaways, first thing that I'm going to discuss is the CRA joint resolution. So certain provisions in NSPS Quad O and Quad OA were rescinded in 2020, but they have been reinstated by Congress under the Congressional Review Act, or CRA as it's abbreviated. And this act is found in the United States Code at 5 USC 801 through 808. And under the CRA, agencies must submit final rules to both houses of Congress, after which Congress may adopt a joint resolution of disapproval to nullify the final regulation. So either the House or Senate must introduce the joint resolution within 60 calendar days of continuous session from the date the final rule is received, which really comes out to session days. And there are some technicalities about timing of the proposals of these joint resolutions. And I'm not going to go into it because I don't think it's that important for our discussion today. I just wanted to give some background on what the CRA is. So the effect of a joint resolution being signed into law is to treat that rulemaking at issue as though it had never taken effect. So Congress used this mechanism to address what's known as EPA's 2020 policy rule. And the CRA resolution was signed into law by President Biden on June 30th, 2021. So this means that the 2020 policy rule is now treated as though it had never taken effect. And this impacts the rule text on the books in 40 CFR Part 60 subparts Quad O and Quad OA. So the 2020 policy rule was called Oil and Natural Gas Sector Emissions Standards for New, Reconstructed, and Modified Source Review. And that was published at 85 Federal Register 57018 on September 14th, 2020. This rule, as I stated, amended Quad O and Quad OA, and specifically it rescinded all the NSPS regarding emissions of VOC and methane from sources in the natural gas transmission and storage segment of the oil and gas industry, as well as the NSPS regulating methane from sources in the production and processing segments. So effectively, the CRA resolution reinstates the 2012 VOC and 2016 VOC and methane standards for the transmission and storage segment, as well as the methane standards for the production and processing segments. Something called the 2020 technical rule comes into play as well, because it was issued pretty much simultaneously with the 2020 policy rule, but it wasn't affected by the CRA joint resolution. It was called that the 2020 technical rule was called Oil and Natural Gas Sector Emission Standards for New, Reconstructed, and Modified Sources Reconsideration. And that was published at 85 Federal Register 57398 on September 15th, 2020. And the technical rule addressed certain technical aspects, obviously, including fugitive emission requirements, provisions to apply for the use of an alternative means of emission limitation, pneumatic pump standards, storage vessel applicability determinations, and engineer certifications. And as I stated, this rule remains in effect and was not addressed by the CRA resolution. So importantly, and the whole reason that I'm noting all of this is that the currently proposed rule, the proposed rule on November 15th of 2021, seeks to update the regulatory text of Quad O and Quad OA in light of the CRA joint resolution. The CRA joint resolution's effects are not reflected in the rule text of the CFR as it exists today. So even though the rules immediately reverted to the pre-2020 policy rule form when the CRA was issued or signed, the rules on the books in the CFR do not reflect this change. So this situation has the potential to cause confusion, and dare I say, is causing confusion. So I recommend taking note of these changes if any of them apply to your facility. And you can see a black link down at the bottom of my slide, and this is a Q&A document that EPA put out on June 30th, 2021, which was the same day the joint resolution was signed. But it's a pretty informative document about the effect of the CRA joint resolution, because it's a little bit complicated with the different rules involved that I just laid out. And there's also some discussion of this in EPA's proposed oil and natural gas methane rule, the one on November 15th, 2021. And also, I should note, I do have a link, a citation to EPA's proposal. It's the second bullet point on my slide, where you can find that in the Federal Register. So a couple more things to say about the oil and gas proposed rule are, EPA is proposing to promulgate a new NSPS Quad O-B and provides a summary of what a potential future rule may look like. However, EPA provides no rule text for such a rule, just a discussion of requirements that such a rule may contain. Notably, EPA has stated that it will be issuing a supplemental proposal prior to finalizing standards, and it's expected that this rule will appear in the supplemental proposal. So all that means that there may be another chance to comment on any proposed rules or standards that EPA comes out with in Quad O-B. EPA states it plans to propose a Quad O-C emission guideline in order to regulate methane from existing sources in the oil and gas source category. So for those that may not be familiar, an emission guideline is a requirement on the state to develop rules for existing sources and submit a state plan on how the state will regulate the existing sources. And that's set forth under Clean Air Act Section 111D. Again, EPA provides no text in the proposal, but states that the emission guideline would contain a presumptive standard that would serve as best system of emission reduction, or BSER, which is a standard that's set forth under the Clean Air Act. And this standard will be presumptively approvable by EPA in the state plan. So again, this would all be set forth in a supplemental proposal prior to finalizing a rule, which is what EPA says in this current proposed rulemaking. So upon the review of the rule, it appears to DEQ that this rule, if finalized, has the potential to increase significantly the universe of facilities affected under this source category. And it just has the potential to grab a lot of facilities to come under regulation. So DEQ is monitoring this and currently drafting comments in conjunction with the Secretary of Environment and Energy to express concerns over this rule. And I will add, comments are due on this rule on January 31st, 2022. Okay, moving on to greenhouse gas litigation from power plants under Section 111D. So my intent here with this slide is to provide some procedural history of the litigation and regulatory actions involving greenhouse gas regulation from existing fossil fuel-fired power plants, i.e. those that would be regulated under Clean Air Act 111D emission guidelines. Basically, this is just to clarify the current status of any rulemaking and litigation and just provide a picture of where things stand. So on this slide, I have a timeline set out of the recent procedural history regarding the Clean Power Plan and the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. And for anyone unfamiliar with this topic, there are previous EPA rulemakings and Supreme Court decisions, but for the purpose of my talk, I don't feel it's necessary to outline those here today. I think just currently at issue is the stuff on the slide that I'm about to discuss. So in 2015, that was when EPA promulgated the Clean Power Plan, which contained a BSER performance rates for steam and natural gas-fired combined cycle units. This rule was challenged in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals in a number of cases, which were consolidated into the lead case titled West Virginia versus EPA. The Supreme Court issued a stay of the Clean Power Plan in February 2016, pending the completion of judicial review at both the DC Circuit level and the Supreme Court level, should a writ of certiorari be sought at the Supreme Court. So, notably, the case was not being heard by the Supreme Court at the time that the Supreme Court stayed the Clean Power Plan. And this was the first time in history that the Supreme Court stayed a rule that was still under review in a lower court. Oral argument, so that case continued in the DC Circuit, and oral argument was heard in the DC Circuit on September 27th, 2016, at an en banc hearing of the court, which means that all judges were present rather than just a panel of judges. And that hearing lasted over 7 hours. In 2017, EPA began a review of the Clean Power Plan, and the DC Circuit case was put into abeyance by the court pending further action by EPA, which just means that the case was kind of on hold. So moving forward, the Affordable Clean Energy Rule was final on July 8th, 2019. And this rule repealed the Clean Power Plan and provided states with a new emission guideline. It established that heat rate improvement measures were BSER for CO2 from coal-fired EGUs, and it listed 6 candidate technologies. It instructed states to establish unit-specific standards of performance that reflect the emissions limitation achievable through application of the BSER technologies. And the issuance of this rule, of the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, led to the DC Circuit's dismissal of West Virginia versus EPA as moot. So that's the first West Virginia versus EPA. It is dismissed, it's moot. That's important because there's a subsequent West Virginia versus EPA case that I'm going to talk about in a second. So a new case was filed in the DC Circuit to challenge the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, titled American Lung Association versus EPA. And on January 19th, 2021, the DC Circuit vacated the Affordable Clean Energy Rule and remanded it to EPA for further consideration. Which brings us to present day and the new West Virginia versus EPA case, which is a case at the Supreme Court as a result of a petition for writ of certiorari to seek judicial review of the DC Circuit decision in American Lung. And the question presented, as stated in the filings, so this is verbatim from court filings, is, does EPA have the ability to regulate greenhouse gas emissions in any industry so long as it considers cost, non-air impacts, and energy requirements. And oral arguments for this case are scheduled for February 28th, 2022, so next month. In summary, on February 12th, 2021, EPA issued a memo stating that the Clean Power Plan is not in effect due to the vacatur of the ACE rule. So just because the ACE rule was vacated, that doesn't mean that EPA reverted back to the Clean Power Plan, and they came out officially and said that. And no further action by states is required at this time to develop any state plans. So there's no Clean Power Plan, there's no ACE, and litigation is underway. That's everything in a nutshell. So moving on to startup shutdown malfunction. A few developments have happened with this over the last couple of years. Starting with the very beginning in 2015, the historic, timeline of things is that in 2015, EPA issued a final rule to do two things. To one, clarify, restate, and revise its guidance concerning its interpretation of Clean Air Act requirements with respect to treatment in state plan implementations of excess emissions that occur during periods of SSM. And two, to issue a finding that certain SIP provisions in 36 state SIPs are or were substantially inadequate to meet Clean Air Act requirements, and they issued a SIP call for those states to revise their SIPs. Oklahoma was included in 36 states, and notably this was due to old provisions of subchapter 9 in the Oklahoma Administrative Code, Title 252, Chapter 100, which are currently still on the books as Oklahoma's SIP, but are not reflective of Oklahoma's current subchapter 9. So for Oklahoma, what did this mean? Oklahoma submitted a letter dated November 7th, 2016 to EPA Region 6 requesting the removal of Subchapter 9 entirely from the SIP. Though Oklahoma did make revisions to Subchapter 9 to remove affirmative defense provisions and instead use the term mitigating factors. And the current version of Subchapter 9 has not been submitted to Region 6 for inclusion in the SIP. EPA has not acted on Oklahoma's withdrawal request due to a hold on SIP actions at the regional level that was initiated around 2017 with the administration change at the time, while EPA reviewed the 2015 rule. So in 2020, EPA published a policy memo that superseded and replaced certain provisions of the 2015 SSM SIP action. It stated specifically that exemption provisions may be permissible in SIPs under certain circumstances where SIPs continue to ensure attainment and maintenance of the NAAQS. And then in 2021, EPA published a memo to withdraw the 2020 guidance and reinstate EPA's prior policy outlined in the 2015 rule. None of these changes or reversals have affected DEQ's requested withdrawal of the outdated Subchapter 9 provisions from the SIP. Region 6 has indicated that they are working on drafting SSM proposals now, so we may have finally have a proposed action on our withdrawal in a few months. So we shall see. And that is where we are to date on startup shutdown malfunction. So moving on to regional Haze. The Regional Haze program is set forth in Clean Air Act sections 169A and 169B. Its stated goal is restoring visibility to natural conditions at Class 1 federal areas. And federal rules implementing this program are found in 40 CFR Part 51, Subpart P. And pursuant to these rules, states are required to submit periodic implementation plans that address visibility impairment in Class 1 areas, both of those areas within the state and outside of the state that may be affected by emission sources within the state. Oklahoma's only Class 1 area is the Wichita Mountains Wilderness area located in southwest Oklahoma in Comanche County. Currently, we are in planning period 2 or round 2 of the Regional Haze state planning. So in a nutshell, to date, in round 2, sources have been selected and evaluated for their potential impacts on Class 1 areas. Detailed presentations on DEQ's source selection methodologies have been made at previous Air Quality Advisory Council meetings over the last couple of years. So that I'm sure there's a way, if you'd like to see that, you can go back on DEQ's website and find that information. Oklahoma's draft plan it has undergone a mandatory 60-day review period by federal land managers, which ended on November 30th, 2021. And during that review period, EPA was given an opportunity to review the draft plan and submitted extensive comments on the plan. DEQ has also shared the draft plan with our tribal partners. DEQ is currently evaluating EPA and FLM comments and preparing responses. And the next step in the process is to release the draft plan for a 30-day public comment period. Okay, and I wanted to talk about a couple NAAQS decisions that EPA has made in 2020 and 2021, specifically PM and ozone. So Sections 108 and 109 of the Clean Air Act govern the establishment, review, and revision, if deemed necessary, of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for each criteria pollutant. And the Clean Air Act requires a periodic review of the science upon which these standards are based and the standards themselves. So periodically, EPA will review our NAAQS and decide whether or not new science indicates that the NAAQS need to be updated or lowered in any way. Each NAAQS has a few different elements to it: the averaging time, the level, and the form. And these vary for each criteria pollutant depending on the behavior of the pollutant when released into ambient air. So particulate matter is interesting because there are numerous different standards for it, depending on fine PM, which is PM 2.5, or coarse PM, which is PM 10, and the primary and secondary standards. So I put a little snip of what the current NAAQS is for PM 2.5 and PM 10, and you can see it's pretty complicated. It doesn't show which of these little squares in the chart are the averaging time, level, and form. But if you see where it says 1 year, 24 hours, that's the averaging time. Where you see 12 micrograms per cubic meter, that's the level. And where you see the annual mean averaged over 3 years, 98th percentile averaged over 3 years, that's the form. So in 2020, EPA finalized a periodic review of the PM standards and retained the standards without revision. And then in 2021, after the administration change, EPA announced it would reconsider this determination, and the proposal is expected this summer. So for ozone, similar to PM, EPA determined in 2020 that it would retain the current ozone standard, which is the 2015 ozone standard. And EPA determined in 2021 that it would reconsider this decision to retain. So for the ozone standard, EPA is currently putting together an ad hoc panel of scientists to review this standard. And the proposal is anticipated in December of this year. And I actually saw, I think last night, that there is information available as to candidates that EPA has, I guess, that are suggested candidates for this ad hoc panel, and comments can be received on those candidates. So the last thing I want to mention is the latest activity of the Air Quality Advisory Council. While not entirely related to federal rulemaking updates, one item is somewhat related. The meeting was held last week on January 19th, 2022 at the DEQ headquarters. 2 rules were presented and passed through the council. So first, DEQ recommended changes to OAC 252-100, subchapters 1, 7, and 8 to incorporate a long-standing permitting policy into the rules. These changes allow facilities required to obtain a minor NSR construction permit to begin construction after submittal of an administratively complete permit application, but prior to that permit's issuance. So facilities may construct, but they may not make the unit operational such that it has the potential to emit air emissions. Of note is that this policy does not apply to PSD construction activities or non-attainment NSR, which fortunately is not applicable in Oklahoma today since we are in attainment for all pollutants currently. Facilities undertake this construction at their own risk, and DEQ retains the authority to deny any construction permit regardless of how much money has been invested in the project. So if you're hearing this for the first time and this is sparking an interest for you, but you have questions, you can always call DEQ, you can call me or the permitting section, and ask your questions. I will say that as to what constitutes making the unit operational, that can sometimes be a case-by-case basis decision. So if you don't want to just do it, without knowing for sure, you can call DEQ always. So additionally, at the meeting, DEQ updated its state rule in OIC 252-100-47, regulating emissions from existing MSW or municipal solid waste landfills to incorporate new federal emissions guidelines. Currently, Oklahoma is under the federal implementation plan relating to these sources, and this rule is the first step in removing that federal implementation plan from applying in Oklahoma. The next step will be to create a state plan for those sources based on subchapter 47. So once the state plan is submitted and approved, the federal implementation plan will no longer apply. The main change is a lowering of the emissions threshold that would require installation of a landfill gas collection and control system. So that concludes my presentation today. Here I've provided a link to sign up for air quality updates from DEQ, which I encourage everyone to do. You can choose between email and text notifications and have quick and easy access to important information from DEQ. Thank you very much. And now I open it up for questions.
Thanks, Madison. So if anyone has questions, they can go ahead and raise their hand or type their question into the chat box and I will read it out. The raise hand function, once again, is either down on the bottom bar or it is under more settings if you're on mobile. And we'll have more time for questions later, but we will just do a short pause now if anyone has questions specifically related to these federal updates. All right, I see one question from Eric Cornwell saying, Advisory Council question, does rule allow construction prior to PSD avoidance? Madison, do you need clarification on this?
Yes. So the term PSD avoidance, I'm not sure what that means exactly. If they could clarify that a little bit.
Sure. So Eric, you can either type in the chat again, or if you raise your hand, I will unmute you. All right, you should be unmuted. Go ahead.
Hey, Madison, thank you so much. I'm from the state of Georgia, and was actually the head of permitting here for several years, and so we would allow for construction prior to permitting for non-PSD sources. But I had heard, I know that our neighbors to the east of us, South Carolina, had some issues with EPA Region 4 about having to they tried to put a rule in place like this, but because of PSD avoidance situations where you got a synthetic miner, that was an issue for EPA. So I didn't know if Oklahoma considered that, if the allowing construction prior to permitting is for true miners or applies to say a expansion at a Title V or a PSD major source permit that was going to avoid PSD by taking, say, a 40 ton per year cap, or if it only applied to minor sources and what you may call natural minor expansions.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So I'm going to say an answer, and I'm going to provide a disclaimer that I'm not the permit engineer, so I could be, they may, need to slap me later, but so take it with a grain of salt. But this rule implementation is going into subchapter 7, which is our minor source permitting rules, and subchapter 8, which is our major source permitting rules. And so it would apply at a minor facility, but it could also apply for a minor NSR modification at a major source, which would be a source under subchapter 8, which is where our Title V rules are housed. So does that answer your question?
Well, I mean, you could, I guess, technically have both of those apply. It really depends on whether or not you need operational limits. And it sounds like I just need to dig into the rule a little bit and see what specifics there are there. But I appreciate your response.
Yeah, no problem. And if you want to, feel free to contact me. My email address, this is for everybody, is Madison, MADISON .Miller, MILLER @deq.ok.gov.
Sure.
And if you want to have further conversation about that, I'm happy to.
All right. Thank you so much.
Sure.
All right.
Thank you. If anyone else has a question, they can go ahead and raise their hand or type in the chat. All right, we've got one more question in the chat from Tammy Wallace. Does this include setting an engine but not hooking it up?
Yes, it does. So you can construct and do everything, but not make it operational. And I believe that we would consider hooking it up to be making it operational.
Tammy says, thank you.
No problem.
All right, good questions. Anyone else wishing to ask their question or type in the chat? All right, we got one hand up from Mike Howerton. I'm gonna unmute you so you can ask your question.
Oh, I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button, apparently. I'm not trying to raise my hand.
Okay, no problem. All right, last call for questions, and then we'll move on to the next segment. All right, seeing none, we're going to move on to our first break. We've got a question in the chat for Madison. So Madison from Adrian Burchett. Question is, has EPA given an estimate of a timeline for issuing Quad OA/Quad OC?
So word on the street, which is by no means indicative of reality, is that maybe spring, summer of this year, but no real timeline is given in the proposed rule or anywhere else. That's about all we know.
Thanks, and Adrian says thanks in the chat. All right, so we will move on to the next presentation from Anne. Anne, if you want to go ahead and get your slides up.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ann Smith, and I'm an engineer in the Air Quality Division's permitting section. So today I'm going to provide an overview of the new public notice requirements for Tier 1 air quality permits. Okay, so today I'm going to begin by giving a little bit of background on why these particular changes were made. I'll then discuss the new requirements in detail, and then we will identify exactly which permits are going to be affected by this change, and then finally how these changes are going to be implemented. Okay, so to get started, these new requirements were adopted by the Environmental Quality Board in February of 2021, and this was on the recommendation of the Air Quality Advisory Council. So these new requirements are intended to bring ODEQ in line with EPA's public participation procedures. So previously, only Tier 2 and Tier 3 permits were required to undergo a 30-day public review period. And this was done through applicants publishing the notices in the newspaper. So as of September 15th of 2021, certain Tier 1 permits are now required to undergo a 30-day public review period. Rather than publishing these notices in the newspaper, these are going to be done by ODEQ through the department's web-based noticing system. Okay, so which Tier 1 permits are affected? For minor source, the individual construction and operating permits, as well as modifications, are affected. For major source, the minor construction modifications to existing major source facilities are going to be affected. So as part of the new requirements, there are now 2 new source review or NSR processing options available to applicants. These are going to be traditional processing and enhanced processing. The applicant will choose between these 2 processing options in the construction permit application. Next, we're going to look at these 2 processing options in more detail. So starting with the traditional process, this process requires review periods for both construction and operating permits. The draft construction permit will undergo a 30-day public review period. During this period, EPA will have the opportunity to comment as a member of the public. However, EPA will not have their own separate review period. Subsequently, the draft operating permit will undergo a 30-day public review period, and for Title V facilities, a 45-day EPA review period. For the minor source permits, after an individual minor source operating permit has gone through the 30-day public review, it will now be considered a federally enforceable state operating permit, or a FESOP. This is going to be the only processing option available for minor source facilities that have not been issued a FESOP, or for major source facilities that have not been issued a Title V operating permit. So once the facility has been issued a FESOP or a Title V operating permit, the applicant now has the option of utilizing the enhanced process for modifications. Enhanced processing requires review periods for only the construction permit modification. The draft construction permit modification will undergo a 30-day public review period, and for Title V facilities, a 45-day EPA review period. Since these modifications have already been reviewed and authorized in the construction permit, the subsequent draft operating permit modification will not need further review. Any modifications that have not been authorized in a construction permit will be required to go through traditional processing. Okay, so this table outlines the public review requirements for minor source permits based on the permit type. So if we start with traditional processing, you can see that there's no public review requirements for PBRs or GPs. As we discussed previously, initial construction permits will be processed under traditional and will require a 30-day public review period through the website. If we move down the table, we have initial FESOPs. These are going to be processed under traditional and will require an online 30-day public review period. Please take note of the asterisk and its corresponding footnote. So existing facilities with an individual minor source operating permit that was issued prior to September 15th of 2021 will not be required to transition their existing operating permit to a FESOP unless a facility action triggers the need for a permit modification. That permit modification will then be required to go through the traditional process. Although once the FESOP has been issued for the facility, all future modifications can then utilize either process. If we can continue under traditional, both construction permit modifications and FESOP modifications will be required to undergo a 30-day public review period online. Then finally, we have the enhanced processing option. Once a facility has obtained a FESOP, construction permit modifications can use the enhanced process. As identified in the table, only construction permit modifications are required to undergo a 30-day public review period through the website. So as I stated previously, the applicant must indicate that they wish to use the enhanced process in the construction permit. This cannot be selected later in the operating permit application. So similar to the previous table, the public and EPA review requirements are outlined here for major source permits. If we start again with traditional processing, we can see all construction permits and construction modifications will undergo a 30-day public review period. As you can see indicated in the parentheses, minor construction permit modifications will conduct the public review through the website rather than submitting those notices through the newspaper. There's going to be no change for Title V operating permits and for renewals. Under traditional processing, minor modifications to Title V operating permits will undergo a 45-day EPA review period. However, significant modifications to Title V operating permits will undergo both a 30-day public and 45-day EPA review period. Existing facilities that have obtained their Title V operating permit now have the option of using the enhanced process for future modifications. Under enhanced processing, only construction permit modifications are required to undergo public and EPA review. Similar to the traditional process, minor construction permit modifications are going to conduct that 30-day review period through the website, as you can again see indicated in the parentheses. Subsequently, the draft operating permit modification will not require any additional review under enhanced processing. Again, it's important to note that the applicant must indicate that they wish to use the enhanced process in the construction permit application. We'll next take a look at the application and see exactly where the applicant can make this selection. So within the permit applications, ODEQ has updated the general facility information page. If we take a closer look, there is now a new row in box 2 that allows the applicant to select which public review process they would like to use. We'll now take a look at exactly how this web-based noticing system for public review is going to be implemented. So as outlined previously, certain permits will be required to conduct that 30-day public review period through the website. This is going to be done by ODEQ, posting the draft permit to the department's public review webpage. The posting will also include the start and end dates of the 30-day public review period. I've included a link to ODEQ's public review webpage. ODEQ is also going to email notifications to interested parties that the draft permit has been made available for public review. This email notification is going to provide the same information as the web posting. If you'd like to receive email notifications, I have also included that link to register as well. So if any comments were received during the review period, ODEQ is going to respond and reply as appropriate. We'll also provide the applicant with a copy of any comments that were received. So here you can see a screenshot of the department's public review webpage. This contains a list of permits that may be open for public review. So as stated earlier, it includes the start and end dates for the public review period. It also includes some basic facility information. If the comment period has ended, the option to leave a comment will no longer be available, as you can see here in the bottom row. So the Air Quality Division has developed a guidance document that covers the new public notice requirements in more detail. This can be found on our website on the Air Permits homepage, as you can see in the screenshot. It's also going to be located under air permit guidance, which is also on our website. Okay. I want to thank you guys for your time. I'll now open up the floor for any questions.
Thanks. We've got a few questions in the chat. So the first one was asking if these slides are going to be available following the webinar, and a member of our staff responded, and the slides are already available on our website. So Malcolm has posted a link to that in the chat just so everyone can see.
Okay, perfect.
And then we've got a question from Stuart Spencer. The question is, are the 30-day public review and 45-day EPA review concurrent or sequential? Parentheses, EPA review subsequent to public review. And maybe they are concurrent unless and until a significant comment is received. Thanks.
So for major source, they are typically done with the public review period first and the EPA review period after. If the applicant would like them to be done concurrently, they can request that.
All right, thank you. The next question is from Jerry. If I have an existing minor source permit and want to modify my permit only to increase my throughput limit, I will need to go through a 30-day public notice and then be required to get a FESOP permit.
So if you already have an individual minor source operating permit and you want to make a permit modification, that permit modification will go through the traditional process, meaning it will go through that 30-day public review period. Once it's gone through that permit modification is going to be a FESOP upon issuance. So after that, then yes, you could utilize enhanced.
All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. And if anyone wants, if these are not, sufficient answers to your questions, raise your hand and we can let you ask a follow-up. So the next question from C. Watson, if comments are received, is there a potential for the permitting period to be slowed?
I would think that would depend on the comment and how much, back and forth that requires with, with the applicant. And then, I guess if it's from EPA or if it's from public, it could potentially slow, I would think, the permitting timeline down.
All right. The next question was about the link to the page, and a member of our staff, Grant Loney, posted a link to the website just for everyone to be aware. So then C. Watson asked another question. If the facility is in an EJ zone, does this timeline change any?
I don't think so. I know we've made some progress. I'm assuming EJ is environmental justice. I'm not for sure on that. That might be more of a question for either Lee or Philip. As of what I know right now, no. But again, I'm not 100% certain on that. If you want, I can check and shoot you an email.
All right, if there are any other questions, we'll wait just a minute and you can either raise your hand or throw your question in the chat. All right, last call. Leave a few more seconds up for any remaining questions. All right, I'm not seeing any more, so we will go ahead and move on to the next segment, which would be Lee.
Sorry, I was managing 3 screens and not quickly.
No worries. We can see your screen now.
Okay. All right. So good morning. My name is Lee Warden. I'm one of the engineering managers with Air Quality, and I'm going to talk about our e-permitting retirement. Many of you may have received an email or noticed on our website that AQD is retiring our current e-permitting system. The system is used by approximately 15% of applicants and therefore not quite paying for itself right now. It has developed some performance issues for those individual applicants that have been using it extensively. So for that reason, we really aren't in a position to make its use mandatory without resolving those problems. And unfortunately, they are more structural in nature. To address these issues and to more fully integrate with our planned changes to our facility management system, we're looking at moving toward a system more commonly used in other state agencies or air quality agencies in the US, we are at the beginning of building out that system, and I can't project a date for a transition on that yet. Okay, but the transition period to the retirement, we have some key dates for you to keep in mind. February 1st, no new applications or new accounts. For those using the system to manage issued permits and any documents related to their applications, you'll need to download documents from the system by April 1st. If that poses a problem, please contact us through the ePermit email account. We will either assist you or extend your access. As we instructed through the beginning of the pandemic period, you can submit applications online using our normal application forms. There is an email link at the bottom of the permit page on the DEQ website, the permit homepage, that you can select to send an email to Richard Keeneland and Philip Fielder. When you click that link, it brings you to a form that will allow you to attach files up to 256 megabytes. So it's a pretty good option for sending a document at as quickly as possible to hit a deadline. It also makes sure, if you use this link rather than emailing us directly, that your application is routed correctly and processed correctly. We don't want it to get lost in the system somewhere. If you're wanting to make payments electronically, and so you can continue to mail checks to us that following the instructions on our applications, but for any electronic payments, you'll need to contact our accounts receivable and they can help you with that, whether it's credit card or some other method. That's the end. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Lee. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand or type in the chat. Right now, I'm not seeing any hands or chat, so we'll give it a few more seconds before we move on. All right, I'm not seeing any questions right now, so we will go ahead and move on to our next presentation, which is by Philip.
Okay. Can you hear me or?
Yes, I can hear you and see your slides.
Yeah, you can see my slide. Okay, great. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. I'm Philip Fielder, Chief Engineer, Air Quality Division, and got another short presentation here. Wanted to give everybody just a real quick update on the oil and gas general permit status. So let's. Oh, There it goes. It wasn't wanting to move. Okay. So just quickly first, just the actual status of it. The initial public review occurred back in August 17. And for those that don't know, this is the second round of this, as it has been an involved project. It's taken more time than we wanted, but in either case, this round was published August 17th of 2020, 30-day public comment period. We received significant comments, and as a result, have updated it. And as a result of those comments, we determined that it's probably best to do another public review round. And so that's what we did. We published that recently, December 16th of 21, for a 30-day comment period. We did extend that comment period until February 1st. So obviously we're pushing the end of that comment period. For those that weren't aware, weren't following, the draft permit memo and permit and all supporting information still is on our website, and you can comment through our website through links. And so that's still going on, obviously, until February 1st. So that's the actual status of it. So I thought maybe I might just touch on some of the bigger significant changes that are happening from the existing general permit, the one that we're currently operating from. So this will include changes that were proposed in the original round and changes that resulted from comments received through both comment periods. So one of the major things we did here is we're now allowing for facilities to choose what type of class they want to operate as, class 1, class 2, and defined here. Class 1 being less than 80%. They're basically taking a cap less than 80% of major source levels. Class 2 is the larger level that remains as the GP is designed currently, up to the 99 tons or just below the major source thresholds. Why are we doing this, or why did we do this? Well, industry was one of the reasons, and that is because for facilities that can select the class 1, there's going to be reduced inspection frequency and less likely to trigger level 1 violations. So that was a need for regulated facilities, and so that was kind of an easy thing for us to do. So that was included. Second thing is we changed the cap from a calendar limit to a 12-month rolling total. This was when the original one was developed, just the policy, the guidance, and the what makes a federally enforceable cap permit just it wasn't as robust as it is today. And so it's been updated to meet full EPA criteria for those types of limit being a 12-month rolling total. We did receive significant comment about the potential burden of doing these calculations. So in the most recent version, if you look at the comments and responses, you'll see that we addressed that. And we did incorporate an additional option to utilize record keeping of throughputs and fuel usage and other supporting data in order to document compliance with the cap in lieu of monthly calculations. And so this is done based on a base set of calculations for which those conditions don't change, and those base set of calculations continue to support actual emissions that can be utilized for compliance with the cap. So that hopefully that satisfies that big issue. Emission factor methodology updated. So again, this is a federal enforceability issue. It's really not that big of a change for industry, but it's just better clarified for the process in order to address federal enforceability. So we'll document emission factor and supporting information for base factors that are utilized when calculations are done for both either the base calculation method or ongoing 12-month rolling totals. And so you'll see that in the different wording in the application and things like that. But that was another significant change. Engine testing updated. So we did felt like we based on the types of compliance and in the testing and what best guidance that we have from EPA that the semiannual testing would satisfy right now in lieu of the quarterly. So this is a slight reduction in PEA testing for engines. And as you can see here, we did also provide an exemption for testing for small engines. This was also a comment we received from industry. We also needed to clarify on maintenance, start, and shutdown emissions and the fact that they are part of the cap. And so it wasn't very clear previously. So we now have a section that addresses MSS activities directly on the calculation methods and allowances. And the fact it's also clearly stated these are part of the cap and must be included. And so if you're interested there, you can go look at those changes and see what we've done there. Control device updates, again, a federal enforceability issue. The previous permit just had some really vague language on, hey, if you operate a control device, hey, just maintain that thing and keep, show that it's being kept up to speed and those types of things. But we really needed specific control efficiencies and associated monitoring requirements to make this an enforceable permit. And so we're obviously very familiar with the devices that are used for controls. They're pretty standard control devices used across the industry here. So you'll see a whole list of those table and those control devices and control efficiencies. And so that's all been updated. So we also added a flexibility here with incorporating new NSPS and NESHAP standards. The previous structure of the GP didn't allow for new equipment to be added if it's subject to a NESHAP or NSPS that's not incorporated into the general permit. Well, since these standards are really applicable outside of permitting, regardless of what type of permit and when you need to get a permit, we didn't feel like that was necessary to stop a facility from gaining access to the GP. And so that was removed. That criteria was removed. Obviously, facilities still need to comply with the NSPS and NESHAP monitoring, reporting, record keeping, all those things that apply regardless. And so that's added flexibility for all of us moving forward. That's going to also benefit us as we deal with permit applications. That should reduce our burden also. So and that's all I've got. If I got any questions.
Thanks, Philip. We've got one hand raised from Natalie Olhausen. Let me know if I didn't say your name right. I'm going to get you unmuted so you can ask your question to Philip.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think that might have been a mistake. I didn't mean to raise my hand. Sorry
Okay, no worries. If there are any questions, okay, I see a few more hands raised. We'll start with Ryan Anderson.
Yeah, so I noticed that how will this permit handle the incorporation of Quad OB? I know that that's been proposed. Will there be an update sent out after that permit or after that regulation is finalized? Probably this year.
I guess, so yeah, the process for that is like any other NSPS and NESHAP. It won't hold a permit up. Basically, we're already going to have a condition. We already have a condition in the permit that any new NSPS and NESHAP regulations that are applicable, the facility is subject to as defined under those subparts and must comply. Yes, that'll be something as far as updating it. As an ongoing process, we'll look at those standards as they're issued and determine if we do need to release a new version of it just to incorporate those. From EPA's perspective on for incorporating those, for any type of permit that we issued, they at minimum, all they really require is the high-level citations. We do have a criteria in our rules, and I believe it's only for major sources, though, that have a process for us opening permits to incorporate those types of things. But yeah, we'll continue to view that, but we don't believe it's a stopper for moving forward for any facility to if these rules get finalized, to continue to utilize this general permit under the way it's currently structured.
Okay. The reason why I was asking is because they included a new definition of legally and practically enforceable in the proposed rule, which appears will have a significant effect upon permitting nationwide.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Hopefully, we'll look at that. But I would think that most of what we're doing here, as you can see, a lot of what we've done is updated the federal enforceable, practical enforceability of this permit.
Okay.
So we're hoping that, we'll write that down as a note to see if that could possibly cause an issue. And if it does, then you're right. Based on the number of facilities that use this, we would want to reopen it and address that. But that is a good comment for us to look at. But hopefully, what we've done here satisfies as best we can that issue.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, we've got another question in the chat from Catherine Chinney. What date do facilities need to reapply for the new ONG general permit?
So when the new permit's issued, we're going to have a phase-in period. Once it's issued, facilities can do that at any time. At that point, obviously, it's an acceptable permit type. For facilities that don't update or don't have a need to update this, they can continue operating under the current general permit for a period up to 24 months. 24 months, we have a 24-month roll-in period. And at that point, we will be updating all existing permits to the new general permit. We're gonna develop a process for that as we get closer to the deadline date, so we haven't worked out all the finite details on how we'll do the notifications and those types of things, and how we'll. There's a few questions we've got to answer, but it is a 24-month roll-in period.
Okay, so if there are any other questions, please type that into the chat now or raise your hands. We'll allow just a few more seconds before we move on to the next presenter. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions, so we will go ahead and move on to the next presentation, which is by Joe.
Sure, let me just get my screen up here. All right, everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, good morning. My name is Joseph Wills. I'm with the Air Quality Division Permitting Group. And today I will be going over some of the updates, policy and calculation updates for tank emission calculations, particularly working and breathing losses. So just a little bit of background. The EPA's AP42 section 7.1 was updated back in November of 2019. The previous version of that section was had a revision date of November 2006. In addition to the November 2019 updates, there were also some minor revisions released in June of 2020. Essentially, some of these updates to the AP42 section are just some general updates to previous guidance, but they have also included additional guidance. So, for instance, meteorological data had been updated from an older 30-year data set, or average of 30-year data set, to a newer 20 years data set. Several equations were updated, such as temperature, pressure range, working loss emissions for fixed roof tanks, and the concept to use net throughput versus total pumping volume. And some additional guidance that they added involved tank cleanings, degassing, emissions tanks calculations for storing hot liquid stocks, which considers various insulation levels. They added a discussion on flashing losses, though no specific methods were provided. And they added a discussion for estimating emissions from low pressure tanks. Now, some of the key issues that have been brought up with the November 2019 update has to do with support of EPA's tanks version 4.09D. So back around, I believe it was around September of 2016, EPA posted onto their website that they were no longer providing technical support for the software and were not planning on any future updates to the platform. Directly in the updated text of the new AP42 section, they indicate that they no longer recommend use of tanks 4.09D, as it was known to have many issues. However, it is still made available through their website for historical purposes. Another concern that they added in discussion was in regards to produced water. Previously, we had received applications that relied on either the speciation methodology outlined in the section or an assumption that 1% of the emissions were based, of the calculated emissions would be that of the crude oil for production type facilities. Excuse me. So in the new section, EPA identifies this free top layer, indicating that if phase separation has occurred in any way, then the properties of the calculations should be based on this free top layer. Additionally, the total throughput of the produced water, not just the hydrocarbon portion, should be used to calculate the emissions. Now, it should be noted that the free top layer is not really defined well. However, like I said, it does assume phase separation. So essentially, if phase separation has occurred, you will need to estimate your emissions based on the properties of that free top layer, not the produced water as a whole. If no phase separation has occurred of the oil water mixture, then you can potentially use the properties of the oil water mixture. However, considering operations at a lot of these production facilities, we're not sure that that would be representative of most scenarios. So if an applicant was going to make that assumption, there would have to be some sort of substantial justification submitted in a permit application. So like I said before, the throughput has to be based on the total produced water, not just, an assumed 1%. And regarding, like I mentioned before, the speciation methodology, AP42 utilizes Rout's law for the speciation methodology. Now, this method is considered appropriate for most hydrocarbon mixtures because it assumes ideal behavior. However, ideal behavior is not appropriate for aqueous mixtures. Therefore, that should not be utilized for the produced water calculation, and therefore it leads us back to estimating the emissions based on the properties of the free top layer. Another concern was considerations for flashing and vapor balance. EPA had previously indicated, or in the previous version of the working loss factor, the working loss emissions, and again, this is from vertical and horizontal tanks. There is a working loss production factor in the equation. Essentially, if turnovers are less than a certain point, the working loss production factor, case of N, would be set equal to 1. If it was over 36 turnovers, then the production factor would be reduced based on an equation presented. And as you can see in this chart, that leads to a pretty rapid reduction in the case of N factor, which directly relates to the calculated emissions, therefore rapidly reducing the working loss emissions. Now, that leads us to concern, because in the updated AP42 section, they indicate that if a tank has flashing losses which occur at the tank, or if vapors from truck loading, or vapors that are collected from loading tank trucks and is routed or vapor balanced back to the storage tank, that the case of N factor should be set to 1 regardless of the turnovers. Now, as you can see, essentially based on this chart, that after a certain point, effectively the turnovers leads to a case of N factor of about 0.2, whereas if the flashing or vapor balancing occurs, we're at 1. So this could effectively increase, depending on your situation, emissions by 5 times, working emissions particularly by 5 times. The reason for this consideration is that by the presence of these other emission types, vapor balancing and flashing emissions, the vapor headspace at the top of the tank is then saturated with more hydrocarbons. Therefore, during the displacement of filling, during working losses, more emissions are emitted. Now, another thing I'd like to point out while we're talking about the case of N is this is also has been a previous source of concern. The case of N factor, because it's mostly based on turnovers, this is why we want you to model each of your tanks separately based on that tank's throughput, instead of taking, let's say, a tank battery with multiple tanks, modeling a single tank with the entire throughput for tanks that are not in series and then distributing across. That generally would reduce the emissions significantly, and you run the risk of significantly underestimating your working emissions. So with these considerations moving forward, we are no longer, or any new apps, we are requesting that applicants update their emissions based on the updated AP42 calculations. Now, this does not mean that if you have an established permit limit, an emissions limit, that we will be requiring you to update your emissions limit. We just want you to update your emissions estimates based on the new methodology. If you are comfortable with the updated emissions with your current emissions limit, then you can keep your emissions limit. If you are concerned with your old limit and the newly updated emissions calculations, then we would encourage you to request a modification to update your emissions limit. As mentioned before, we're no longer accepting the older AP42 calculation methodology, the November 2006 revision. Calculations based on they're utilizing EPA tanks 4.09D will no longer be accepted. Using a 1% of the produced water throughput for produced water and using properties of produced water as a mixture will no longer be accepted. Now, I'd like to note Again, that is for the working and breathing losses specifically. That guidance is we are not holding for flashing calculations or for tank truck loading emissions. Please refer to our flashing guidance document and our tank truck loading guidance document on our website for guidance how to deal with produced water. For these updates, we did post these updates. I believe it was mid-April of 2020 that we posted the requirement to update calculations based on the new methodology. And for the produced water considerations, we made that post on our website in mid-April of 2021. In response to EPA no longer supporting tanks 4.09D, it put us and a lot of our applicants in the situation of not being able to easily calculate their emissions for the tanks. So we ended up developing a tool, which can be found at that link there. And we have been providing various updates to it. We do have plans to update it more significantly, as currently it really only handles vertical fixed roof tanks and horizontal fixed roof tanks. It does consider hot liquid stocks, and all the guidance has been presented here in this presentation, but it does not yet handle roof landings, tank cleanings, speciation, and a couple of other things, which will be planned for future release. But at this point, we don't have an estimated date for that. And so with that, like I said, the tool can be found here at this website. And now I would like to go through a quick demonstration of the tool. So I'm going to go to our website here. Sorry about that. Hold on. Let's see. Okay. All right. So here I've going to our web browser, going to our DEQ homepage at deq.ok.gov. And then I'm going to hover over this permits on the blue ribbon here. And under air permits, I'm going to click on permit guidance. Once I'm at this page, I'm going to go down here and I'm going to click on the tab oil and natural gas. And I'm going to go down to storage tank emissions calculation tool. Now that brings us to the tool on our website. We also do offer a downloadable file through which you can acquire through which comes to you in a zip file format. And that tool can be used offline as well. There are online links in there to get you to AP42, to get you to our website, so on and so forth. But it is essentially a fully offline tool. It does use a web browser because it's designed to use HTML and JavaScript. A couple of notes on this page here. We do have release notes down at the bottom, which I won't go over now. They're just there for anybody's reference. And if there are any questions regarding this tool, again, you can use this Contact Richard Keeneland fielder that was described in an earlier presentation here. For this purpose, I'm actually not going to use the storage tank calculation tool. I'm going to use the offline downloadable tool, which, like I said, comes up in the browser, and it's just not surrounded by the rest of the DEQ website. So the first thing that comes up is the terms and conditions. Pretty much it just says this was developed by the Oklahoma DEQ, utilizing the calculation methodology of AP42, and that please do not alter the code for submittal, and do not rebrand the code as your own and sell it. So for this quick demonstration, I'm just going to model a typical 400-barrel storage tank located at a well site. So to get started, We can choose tank type here, vertical fixed roof. These are optional, not needed. And so we can, once all our selections are here, we just hit the next button. Then there's this site selection drop down. I'm just going to type in OK for Oklahoma City. It provides the data just for reference here. None of the fields can be modified or updated. They're just there for reference. Click the next button. And then we here, the next box is to select the tank contents. Now we have two methods of entering tank contents. One, we can select from a database, or two, you can do user manual entry. User manual entry requires you to have a bit more information, and I'm not going to go into that today. For simplicity, I'm just going to click the calculator database. It is important. I do want to point out that there are these tooltips over here. As indicated here, our tooltips do include some of the different guidance and considerations, such as the produced water guidance here that was posted to our website. Here, I'm going to just do a crude oil, essentially mid-continent crude oil, which is the gold standard RVP5 from EPA tanks, 4.09D. Again, these are grayed out, so at this point, none of these are need to be entered. If we had selected the manual entry, this would not be grayed out, and some data points would need to be entered. So I'm going to go ahead and click next. I'm just going to put in the dimensions for a typical 400 barrel tank. Minimum liquid height. If this is unknown, you can refer to the tooltip. And for vertical tank, it says enter 1. For a horizontal tank, enter 0. Again, this is a vertical tank, so I'm going to enter 1. Average liquid height. The tooltip indicates the half full level, so 10. And for maximum height, the tooltip suggests using 1 foot less than the shell height. So shell height's 20, so I'm going to enter 19. Now, once I tab out of this, two new boxes will come up for turnovers and net throughput. Now, for here, if the turnovers is unknown, then leave this field blank and then go down and enter the throughput below. This also works vice versa. If you don't know the throughput, but you do know the turnovers, entering one will calculate the other. So I'm just going to enter a kind of a default value of mine for testing. Once I do that, you can see a window pops up at the top indicating that turnovers will be calculated, which it has. And since I indicated this is a production site, there is flashing present, and the tooltip goes over more detail about when to enter yes for this. Then I'll proceed going on. Shell characteristics, I'm just going to be simple and say white new. And for the roof characteristics as well, and roof type, I'm going to select a dome roof. If you don't know the height of your dome roof, just can enter 0, and some more entries will be added to estimate. The roof radius, the default here is indicated as 12. As indicated by the tooltip, EPA recommends using the shell diameter, which we have already entered over here for that calculation, and the tool will calculate the roof height later. It's going to continue. Breather vent settings, these are EPA defaults. If this is increased beyond a certain point, a vapor gauge pressure will be required for entry. However, I'm going to keep this simple for now. There's heating and insulation options, as you can see here. Again, I'm going to keep this simple, and I'm just going to say no and no for tank heating and tank insulation. But this is where we incorporate the ability to enter or to determine whether inputs are needed for hot liquid stocks. Going to hit next there, and then we're going to go to the calculations. So for calculation basis, we're going to select the only option here, annual. In a future release, we will include a monthly calculation, similar to the way EPA Tanks 4.09D had. And then we have the option for display output, detailed or summary. I'm going to click a detailed here. Click run calculation, and we get an input summary of everything that was input by the user. Information based on the meteorological data, input data for the that'll be used for the liquid, and then similar to Tanks 4.09D, goes through the variables that were used for the calculation methodology. And at the bottom with the standing, working, and total losses. Again, this calculator does not calculate flash emissions; it just calculates working and breathing emissions. So with that, I believe I will turn it over to Christina to take any questions.
Yes, we've got one question in the chat for you from Brandy Zerwinski. Let me know if I said that wrong. Question is, if the produced water emissions are greater than the permit limits based on the new calculation methods, is this considered a permit violation? If so, would a self-disclosure be advised in addition to a permit modification?
So as I had indicated before, this could potentially lead to an applicant wanting to reconsider how they've estimated their emissions limit, and may require a modification going forward. Because this is based on this tool we're really using to establish a permit limit, just because you update your emissions in a permit application, let's say, and it exceeds what your current permit limits are, the way you demonstrate compliance with your permit limits is based on actual emissions. So as long as your actual emissions can still be considered lower than your current permit, then I don't think we'd have a problem there. Otherwise, you may want to reach out and submit an application to modify your permit limits.
Great. So the next question is from Clark Watson asking, for the offline version of this calculator, can users input data for areas in other states, or are current the city-related items set points that cannot be changed?
Sure. So right now the current calculator it's pretty much set up to it has all the data from what's in AP42. So the only enterable thing for site selection is the site itself, and then it's I believe it's table. Let me just check here. It shouldn't take me very long here, so shouldn't waste our time. I think it is 7.1-7. So it pretty much just takes all of this data, which is already in AP42, and lists that. So as far as site-specific entries, no, we do not have that entered at this time. And I don't know if that's something that's going to be entered or allowed in the future necessarily. And this is probably a good question for me to bring up, that this tool really isn't meant to be a full-on replacement of the Tanks 4.09D. There are many other available commercial tools that are much more robust, can handle many more situations. This was just a tool that was developed to get us back in the game. So if another tool is needed, I would definitely recommend seeking out other commercially available tools.
Awesome. So we've got a few more questions. So Catherine Williams was asking where this demonstration is on the website, and Grant went ahead and dropped a link to that in the chat, just so everyone knows about that. And then Tammy Wallace asks, how does your calculation tool emissions, parentheses, working/breathing, compare to ProMax?
This is a good question, and I had briefly discussed this last week in preparation. I am not exactly sure how ProMax or any of the other process simulators such as HYSYS or WinSim or any of those are doing it. I know in an older version of ProMax, they were using the AP42, the older AP42 methodology, and they were taking the contents as a whole. So not the free top layer, but for produced water, but the entirety of the produced water mixture, and basing that on calculation for calculations. I have not been able to confirm whether or not Promax has incorporated that free top layer a guidance by EPA, or if it's still based on the other methodology. Should there be any concerns with that, you can reach out to your Promax representative, or you can just simply utilize this tool and submit that as well. As you saw, the calculation methodology really isn't that difficult, and there are means of entering some other values, more specific tank content information other than just what's provided in the database. But we will be looking into that.
All right, Tammy says, thank you. So I guess you answered the question appropriately. So Ron asked or said in the chat, according to BR&E, they incorporated a software update to 6-2020. If there are any other questions, please go ahead and insert that in the chat or raise your hand and I will unmute your line. Last call for any questions. All right, we've got one from Stefan Steele. Does this allow for calculations with diesel?
I believe diesel is in here on my screen here. Under tank contents, you can do calculator database, refined petroleum liquids, and I believe you would be using number 2 fuel. There are a couple of other liquids that we know, such as like hot mix asphalt. The AP42 section actually recommends using tanks 4.09D. I have not incorporated that into this yet, but probably will be in the next release, which, as indicated previously, is still undetermined at this point. But yes, diesel is an option.
Great. So there's another question from Shannon in the chat. If we use this methodology for the EI and water tanks are over 6 TPY, should we submit a SD at the same time?
That would probably be a wise decision at that point. And some of that is kind of going to be at the discretion of emissions inventory or compliance enforcement.
Another question from Brandy. How do we incorporate the KN factor into the DEQ tanks method, setting to 1 as suggested in the previous slides?
Sure. So this, as you can see here under tank dimensions, this flash or vapor balanced, by indicating yes here, that will set the case event factor equal to 1. And this was incorporated in our initial release, but it was only in reference to vapor balance. We did not include the guidance on flashing. And as you can see here, we've I can't show it comparatively necessarily, but there's a significant tooltip here to indicate when this should be selected as yes, so that the case event factor is set to 1.
Next up, we have Preston. So Preston, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Christina. Good morning, everyone. I am Preston Loving, and I am the compliance manager in the Air Quality Division. And I'm going to go over this morning, give you kind of a brief rundown of what compliance monitoring strategy means. And if you've ever wondered why your facility is inspected or inspected on whatever regular basis, this should be able to answer your question. So the compliance monitoring strategy, or otherwise known as CMS, is a policy that EPA has developed to ensure that the regulated facilities across the country are evaluated for compliance on a regular basis. Compliance monitoring is one of the key components that EPA and DEQ uses to ensure that the regulated community obeys environmental laws and regulations. And this also encompasses all regulatory agency activities that are performed to determine whether a facility is in compliance with an applicable state and federal environmental regulation. So the CMS establishes national goals for conducting full compliance Clean Air Act evaluations. And this encompasses three source categories. The first one is our Title V facilities, also known as major sources. So these facilities are inspected once every 2 fiscal years. Title V mega sources, these are the largest of the major sources, and due to their complexity, these are we conduct full compliance evaluations at these facilities once every 3 fiscal years. But I'll break these down into more detail here shortly. And then our last category is our SM80 or synthetic minor 80 facilities, and these facilities are inspected once every 5 fiscal years. And I did put a little note here that the DEQ uses the state fiscal year, which runs from July 1st through June 30th of each year, rather than the federal fiscal year. And then I also put a note down here as well that the DEQ reserves the right and has the authority to inspect any facility regardless of source classification within the state of Oklahoma. In addition to the source classifications that I just previously listed, these also include minor sources, synthetic minor less than 80 sources, and also unpermitted sources. So we occasionally do include these 3 sources into our CMS. So breaking these source classifications down, the Title V major sources, these are facilities that have permitted emissions above the major source thresholds. And the major source thresholds, these vary depending on the type of pollutant. We have 2 different types of pollutants. We have the criteria air pollutants and our hazardous air pollutants, or HAPs. For criteria air pollutants, these are your pollutants such as nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter. So these are all examples of criteria air pollutants, and the major source threshold for criteria pollutants is 100 tons per year. For HAPs, these are what we consider toxic air pollutants, or simply air toxics. These pollutants are those that are known or suspected to cause cancer or other serious health effects. And currently we have 188 different compounds that are identified and classified as hazardous air pollutants. The major source threshold for hazardous air pollutants are 10 tons per year for individual HAPs and 25 tons per year for a combination or a conglomerate of HAPs. The Title V major sources are evaluated for compliance through full compliance evaluations at a minimum of once every 2 fiscal years. Some of these sources are actually evaluated more frequently on an annual basis due to their significance and or complexity level. So these are going to be some of your larger Title V facilities that would not necessarily fall into the mega source classification. But these are on the upper end of the Title V classifications. And then as of the 2022 CMS, we currently had 249 facilities that were permitted as major sources in the state of Oklahoma. The next category is the mega site sources. Now, these sources are the largest of the Title V sources. And the number of these facilities is actually small. We currently only have 5 facilities in the state of Oklahoma that's identified as mega source. These facilities are evaluated for compliance through a full compliance evaluation once every 3 fiscal years. And due to the complexity of these facilities, DEQ will conduct several partial compliance evaluations, or PCEs, which will focus on a particular unit or set of rules, not the entire facility. And these PCEs are then used in constructing and producing the individual FCEs at the end of that 3-year period. And then the last category is the synthetic minor 80 sources, or SM80s. These sources emit or have the potential to emit at or above 80% of the Title V major source threshold. And I kind of broke this down to kind of explain what an SM80 is. But if a facility has the potential to emit, say, 145 tons per year of NOx, but the facility has installed some kind of control mechanism to limit the NOx emissions to, say, 90 tons per year, then the facility would then be classified as an SM80 source, since those NOx emissions with controls are above 80% of the 100 ton per year major source threshold, but are below 100 tons per year. SM80 sources, these are evaluated for compliance through a full compliance evaluation once every 5 fiscal years. And as of the 2022 CMS, we had 1,687 facilities across the state of Oklahoma that's classified as an SM80. And I took a look at, I pulled up all the numbers of the number of FCEs that we have conducted over the last 10 years, technically 9 years, and then I included our current fiscal year, FY22. So you can kind of see there the number of full compliance evaluations that our AQD inspectors have conducted over the last decade. So currently we have 315 facilities that's targeted for an FCE this current fiscal year. So I'm not going to pull up the document that that EPA has, the EPA policy document that shows the CMS policy. But if you would like to dig into this, it's about a 15 to 20 page document, and you can either use this link here, or you can just simply Google EPA Clean Air Act Compliance Monitoring Strategy, and there'll be a link that you can click on. It'll be right there. So with that, my presentation is finished. If you have any questions, if you can't think of anything right now, feel free to reach out to someone in the compliance and enforcement section at these numbers listed here. We have a number for the Oklahoma City office and the number for the Tulsa office as well. So with that, I will turn it back over to Christina if anyone has any questions.
Thanks, Preston. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand, or you can type it out in the chat and I'll read it out. All right, I see one question in the chat from C. Watson. What makes a site a mega Title V?
These are going to be facilities that are, it's going to be a facility like a petroleum refinery, one that has many different process units subject to a plethora of federal and or state regulations. I don't believe there's any set criteria that defines what a mega source is, but these are going to be the largest of the Title V sources. So it's going to be like your petroleum refineries, some military installations, some combustion sources as well. But generally, it's going to be those facilities that are subject to many different rules and regulations, and then also have quite a few process units. It's just easier to break those. It's easier to conduct full compliance evaluations at those facilities once every 3 years than every other year, just simply due to their complexity. They're large, and it requires several inspectors' eyes on the various process units and process groups to be able to produce the full compliance evaluation.
Great. So we got another question in the chat. It's from Mark Webster asking, what is a typical turnaround time for a minor source FCE to a declaration of findings of some sort?
Well, that's going to vary. We do require that our inspectors, once they conduct the full compliance evaluation, to make every attempt to get their report into our peer review process within 28 days. Now, granted, sometimes that's going to be sooner. It's also going to be later than the 28 days, and that's also going to be dependent on the complexity of the facility. And then also it depends on whether there are violations that have been brought forth in the FCE, and that could slow down the process. If there are no violations, the turnaround time it can be fairly quick. It just depends on how long it goes through the peer review process. So the inspector submits the report for peer review for another inspector to review. Then it goes through their manager, and then if there are violations, it goes through the senior manager, and then it also goes through our attorneys. So it varies, but we try to get those out. We try to get those out the door, as quick as we can. But it varies. So I can't really give a set time on when you can expect a turnaround. But we do the best we can on getting those out the door.
Great, thanks. If there are any other questions, please raise your hand now or type in the chat. I'll allow a few more seconds. This will be a last call for questions for this presentation. Okay, we got one more question. Is there a rule of thumb for FCEs at synthetic minor 80 facilities?
I think he's referring to less than synthetic minor 80 facilities. Is that just to clarify? Is that what he's referring to? Okay.
Yes. Sorry, I read it incorrectly.
Currently, synthetic minor less than 80 sources are not part of the CMS, but we occasionally do include those into the CMS. We don't really have a set rule to be able to include those in the CMS, but we do occasionally include those into the CMS. It may be that we are looking at going out and using the FLIR camera at a well site or maybe even a compressor station. Could be also based on a complaint-based issue, something like that. But again, SM less than 80s are not included in the CMS.
Great, they said thanks. So sounds like you answered that question. If there are any more questions for Preston, please go ahead and ask them now. Otherwise, we're going to move on to the next presentation. All right, let's move on to our next presentation, which is by Rick. So whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Christina. My name is Rick Groshon, and I'm the manager over the compliance and enforcement group for air quality. Today, I just kind of want to give a quick update on our interpretation of annual for the purposes of NSPS and NESHAP rules. Over the years, DEQ and industry have had discussions over the meaning of annual in context of federal rules, mainly regarding inspections, testing, and maintenance requirements. The strictest interpretation of annual would mean a facility would have to conduct an event or an activity no more than 365 days from the previous event. So if you did one January 1st, 2021, we would expect it by January 1st, 2022. The most liberal interpretation would give a facility until the end of the following calendar year. So if you did an activity on January 1st, 2021, it would need to be conducted by December 31st of 2022. So today I want to clarify DEQ's interpretation of annual based on our best reading of all the rules and what we believe makes the most sense when the rule itself does not directly speak to or define annual. DEQ has historically interpreted annual to mean once every 12 months, or more specifically, within the 12th month since the last maintenance, inspection, etc. This interpretation was recently challenged in the belief that annual means a calendar year. Specifically, a company challenged DEQ interpretation on NSP or on NESHAP subpart quad Z requirements to do certain maintenance events annually. DEQ interprets this requirement that the maintenance be performed 12 months or within the 12th month after the last maintenance events occurred. The company in question interpreted this requirement to mean maintenance must be performed by the end of the following calendar year after the last maintenance event. Using the latter interpretation, if a maintenance activity was performed in January of 2022, they would have until December of 2023 to conduct the next maintenance. So that would be virtually 2 years between maintenance activities. And DEQ does not believe this meets the intent of the rule and is not consistent with other rules as written. DEQ's historical interpretation of annual is to mean a 12-month period. Notably, this is how DEQ interprets annual in the context of annual compliance certifications for Title V facilities. And to date, the DEQ interpretation of annual in this context has not been challenged. Subsequently, DEQ's interpretation of annual to mean a 12-month period is applied consistently across NSPS, NESHAP, and Title V, unless a particular rule defines it differently. For example, NSPS Quad K defines annual as no more than 14 calendar months following the previous performance test. So that gives a little bit of wiggle room on that rule. And then NSPS Quad L defines annual as between 11 and 13 months following the previous test. So both of those rules give an actual definition of annual. And so we believe that our 12-month interpretation is consistent with how those rules are written. So in conclusion, DEQ's interpretation of annual to mean a 12-month period has been historically and consistently applied. And we believe that industry is aware that this has been DEQ's interpretation, but wanted to clarify this in light of the recent challenge by one of our regulated companies. Does anybody have any questions for me?
Yes, I see one hand up from Thomas Berner. Let me know if I didn't say that right. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you so you can ask your question. All right, Thomas, looks like you put your hand down. If you still want to ask your question, you can put it back up. I'm going to move on to the next person. Katrine Hendricks, I'm going to get you unmuted so you can ask yours.
Hi, so is 12 months like within the date of the 12-month activity or within the last day of the month that activity occurred in?
In order not to have calendar creep, we have interpreted that to be the last day of the month that from the previous year. Title V's annual compliance certifications are a little bit different because they're basically based on the 365 days since the permit was issued. So that's even a little bit more strict than we interpret for NSPS and NESHAPs.
All right, we've got a few questions in the chat. One from J.R. Heimer asking, so DEQ interpretation for annual sounds like a rolling 12-month. Is that correct?
Yes, basically, yes. And we just give until the end of the month. And that now is consistent with the new general permit. And so we believe we're within the interpretation that we're using across the board.
Okay. The next question from Stephanie says, with regard to Quad Z hours of operation, the EPA Q&A document specifically, it looks like you cut out there, but your hand's raised, so I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, so the EPA has put out a Q&A document for the RICE rules. And with regard to the hours of operation, they specifically say that's based on a calendar year. So I want to make sure that you guys aren't changing your interpretation of that.
Is that in regards to annual, or is
Yes,
that another,
is
that a yearly?
No, it's an annual requirement. And they specifically note annual means calendar year in their document.
Okay, I will take another look at that. Yeah, that says calendar year.
Yeah, so they say, although the term year is not defined in subpart 4Z, in all cases, the EPA interprets year to mean calendar year because it is the most appropriate time frame for monitoring the operation of emergency and limited use rice.
That is specific to that particular incident for the limited use.
No, that's just the hours of operation limits for emergency generators.
Yes, and that was one of them that was cited, but that is for yearly. Asked if year means calendar year, but for annual requirements, such as the maintenance, we believe that the 12th month is still the proper interpretation.
Okay, just making sure that when we're tracking hours of operation for purposes of compliance with the limit, which also impacts when maintenance needs to be done, we're still working on a calendar year though for that purpose, correct?
I believe in that case, yes. But if you would like to contact me through my email, anybody can do this. My email is richard.groshon, GROSHONG, @deq.ok.gov. I can answer more specific.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you.
You bet.
Thanks. I will go ahead and move on to the next question. So Adrian Burchett, looks like in the chat just mentioned EPA once gave guidance that the annual maintenance requirement was a calendar year requirement. The next question from Melissa Benzai asks, has ODEQ published this interpretation anywhere, i.e. a memo or other document available on website? If not, does it plan to?
We have not yet. This happened somewhat recently, so we are developing something that we can post, but we just have to get it finalized, get it through all the review.
All right, so there's a question from Jeremy Meeks that says, you mentioned a few rules that mention 11 to 13 months. This includes the relatively new rule MACT 5D for annual tune-ups. Why not adopt this stance?
And because the newer rules are specifying, we can look at that, but since each of these rules, like Quad K says 14 months, Quad L says 11 to 13 months. Each of those are different. So we just believe that the 12 months is defensible and is consistent with Title V and other rules like that.
All right, and there's another question that mentions one we already addressed, but Brian McKibben asks, can you guys please prepare this as a memo or publication on the website for guidance?
Yes, we'll try and get that done as quickly as possible.
All right, it looks like there was a hand raised, but I think they put it down. If you still have a question, go ahead and raise it again and I can get you unmuted. There we go. Jeremy Meeks, I'm gonna unmute your line. You may also have to unmute on your end.
Hey, thanks. Sorry, I was talking to brick wall there for a second. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So I asked a question about the 11 to 13 months, and I guess just to put a little bit more context to it, whenever we have to do things like an annual tank seal inspection, let's just say we do the seal inspection today, and then what you're saying is it's due next January. But a lot of times, even having a 1 month time frame constrains, operational flexibility where, hey, we can do the inspection in December, but January is going to be like, I guess where I'm coming from is constraining it to a month is difficult sometimes from operations standpoint. And so, I kind of like that Boiler Mac rule where they give you basically a 3-month window, a month before and after the month. And it still qualifies as annual. Of course, I get what you're saying about, going in from January to the next December, 24 months away is unreasonable. But I guess I'm just throwing out there my 2 cents that 11 to 13 months seems reasonable without being too constraining.
Well, NSPS KB is one that specifically addresses the once every 12 months for primary and secondary, for primary seal or the secondary seal inspection.
I believe the language says once per year. For internal floating roofs, it's once every 12 months, but for external, it's once per year. I could be wrong on that, but it is a little bit vague.
Yeah, that for the internal floating roofs, it is once every 12 months. So that's kind of where that was actually one of our reasons for going with the 12 months in the annual is the older rules that do kind of define it. And I understand what you're saying. I understand it's operationally, but then we have to have a certain time frame, or then somebody will say, well, it says 11 to 13 months, but if we just go outside that 13 months, what's going to happen then? So there has to be a set period.
All right, are there any other questions for Rick? You can go ahead and put those in the chat or go ahead and raise your hand. I'll wait just a few more seconds for any other questions. All right, I see one in the chat from Melissa. Is ODEQ aware of other state agencies who have issued similar or conflicting guidance?
I'm not aware of any other states. And EPA, sadly, has not addressed this issue that I could find. I've looked in the ADI before, and they either nobody's asked the question or they just haven't addressed it.
All right. And it looks like I missed one in the chat from J.R. Heimer, who just says, I agree, Quad C maintenance and non-emergency runs. It calls out a calendar year and not a rolling total. I asked our DEQ permit engineer this question last week, and they indicated it was a calendar year and not a rolling 12-month year.
Okay, we'll take a look at that. Because there may be a difference between yearly and annual in the rule. And so that may be where there's some confusion as well.
All right, last call for questions before we move on to our last presentation. All right, in the chat, Stephanie says, I agree with Jeremy Meeks with his information. I thought there was a federal interp to describe the one once a year for KB external, but I would need to search for it to know for sure. So just going off of the previous conversation. And Stephanie asks, would ODEQ honor that interpretation?
I can tell, let's see, I can give her that citation right now for external floating roofs is 60.113B, small b, 1II. And so that's in the same section as the previous, the external or internal floating roofs with once every 12 months.
Okay, we got a few more in the chat. Mark Webster says, KB does say once per year, and many other states have adopted that 3-month window, but ODEQ has been doing the 12-month for long enough that we just do it every May and never June. And then Stephanie says the interp mentions 11 to 13 months for inspections.
What interpretation? I'm sorry.
I believe from the previous, Stephanie's previous question.
Was KB?
Oh, the federal interp I mentioned, but I need to search for it. Yeah, the KB external.
Oh, okay. Yeah, if you find that and can email that to me, I'll take a look.
All right, any other questions? Going once. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions, so let's turn it over to Carrie. Carrie, whenever you're ready.
All right, can you hear me and see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Excellent. Hi, those were some great questions. I am Carrie Schroeder, the Emissions Inventory Manager, and today I'm going to go over some updates and reminders for your inventory reporting. I'm happy to see so many people are signed on today because to me that means I'm probably going to get some good inventories because you guys have or will have the information after I present, and from the other sections, that means we're going to be seeing some good permit applications and hopefully some good compliance. So my presentation this morning, I will go over who's in my section. I'll go over some helpful web pages, some reminders for emission inventory reporting, as well as some new things this year. I'll highlight one of our major quality control issues we've seen recently, and then I'll talk about the future of our program. So in our section, there is me, Carrie, as well as Michelle, Michael, Grant, Shandy, and our newest member is Landon. You can contact us individually through our emails, or especially during the reporting season, I'd probably recommend that you use our group email, which is aei@deq.ok.gov. That's a shared email in which anybody in the staff can start grabbing questions out of there and replying. Alternatively, you can call our 4100 number, our Oklahoma City number, and ask for emissions inventory. There's been, with the pandemic, there's been no change in our availability. You can still reach us by phone or email. If you've never reported an emissions inventory and you've been tasked to do that, you can go to the same website that you registered for this workshop, and you'll notice there are some prior emission inventory recordings on there. So if EI is really new to you, then I would actually recommend these first 3 trainings. The first one, Slice User Registration, that's registering for an account, what permissions you'll be granted, and how to prepare for reporting. And then the Slice User Interface, that is you entering data, how to enter data in Slice, what steps to go through. And then the Slice template use and bulk operations, that's if you want to upload data in mass. You'll download a template and then upload it. So those are the 3 main ones to get you started if it's your first time reporting. Another great resource is our frequently asked questions page. And I've given the link here. You'll notice that it is our reporting guidance page, and there's other tabs as well. But the frequently asked questions of who must submit an inventory? How often do I need to submit one? How do I do it? Those basic ones can definitely help you out if you're new. And if you forget about those web pages that I just mentioned, and you go straight to Slice, which is our online reporting system, then on that login page, on the home page, you'll notice all of that information is here as well. So the first one, Slice training webinars, those are the prior workshops that I mentioned. And then there's frequently asked questions down here, as well as other helpful documents and tools. So all of our air quality forms can be found on this website that I give. You'll notice that there's a tab called Common Air Forms, and some that you might use frequently are on here, such as designating a new responsible official or getting somebody else that's not an RO a Slice account. You can use this 733 form. Some of the common permitting forms are on here, but if you need more, you can go to that tab. So all air quality forms are in one location here. Some important dates, and you may want to put this on your calendar as a reoccurring event. So we have created what we call report stubs in Slice. So we create those by January 1. We've already created them, and that will show you that there's a reporting requirement for your facility, and you need to start that report. And then you need to finish it by April 1st. That is the due date. If you get an approved 30-day extension, then it would be due by May 1st. And then we're sending out invoices on July 1st. This is another one you probably want to put on your calendar to ensure it gets paid on time. The invoice will say on there that the due date is July 31st, and you'll be subject to a 1.5% per month penalty if it is late. And then another reminder is that facility transfers are due 30 days from transfer. So if you sell your facility, don't wait until the reporting season. You know, that could be a year later, or even more than that if it's a facility under a permit by rule. Don't wait until that time to notice, oh, that facility is still under my company. Please get those transfers in as the rule requires. Our annual operating fees, we bill 2 years in arrears. So the 2021 inventories that you're submitting right now will be billed next year in 2023. This allows us time to do quality control on your inventory. And the Title V operating fee was set at $32.30 per ton in 2008, and it's adjusted yearly based on the change in the annual consumer price index. So for this year, for July 2022, the Title V fee is $42.50 per ton. And the minor source fee is set at $25.12 per ton. If you want to find this information later, we do have a web page to go to, and I've provided the link there. It also has more information, such as how we do not double bill pollutants and whatnot. And we do try to post the next Title V rate towards the end of the year. Once we know the new consumer price index adjustment, we'll get that posted. So you can look there if you need that, or you can call us. We get some phone calls on it. Something that I definitely wanted to highlight this year is companies that are paying by electronic payment. And this has become more of an issue this past year. I think maybe because of the pandemic, more companies are going toward electronic payment. But on the invoice, and this is a screenshot, this is a clipping from the invoice as to what it looks like. It does say if you're paying electronically, you need to notify our accounts receivable department, and that's arhelpdesk@deq.ok.gov. And that is pretty critical. If you don't do that, we don't know that you've paid at all, because electronic payments for the state go into just a general state account, and DEQ actually has to make a request for that money. We have to claim it, essentially. We have to say, okay, this is our money. This company paid on this date, and that's the only way we get that money. So if you do not notify our AR help desk, then we don't know it's there, and we will call you and take up more of your time. You'll need to track down when the money was sent and all of that. So please, when you're paying electronically, please email AR help desk and provide your invoice number, the amount you sent, which is hopefully the total it was due, and the date you sent it. Permit by rule facilities. Good news for you guys, you don't need to report in 2021 unless the facility registered under a permit by rule in 2021, or the facility reported not yet built as the status in 2020. So 2020 was the big reporting year. So we won't be seeing a lot of PBRs reporting for this year. We do, as I mentioned, we still need to know about ownership changes. So please submit Form 100-883 if there's been a change in ownership. Please submit that within 30 days of the change. Another thing to mention on these PBRs is if you want to terminate your permit if your facility's closed. If you believe it's permit exempt or de minimis, then please submit that paperwork. And a reminder that PBR facilities are still billed annually. We'll bill on your last emissions that you reported to us. Another reminder, while you're in Slice, please take a look at all of your company users, company and facility users, and ensure that those are up to date. If you have an administrator role, you can remove other users from your company accounts, but we would like to know about that so that we can deactivate those users if they no longer work at your company. We don't want them just floating around in Slice unassociated with any facility. And if you need to change any of your users, you can submit Form 100-882 for a new responsible official, which is the only person that can submit an inventory. They have submitter permissions. And then you can utilize Form 100-733 for anyone else, for your consultant, for anyone else at the company that's going to be filling out your inventory. And I've already mentioned this, to give us those change of ownerships no later than 30 days following the change. But also here I'll mention that the new owner is subject to existing permit conditions and or compliance schedules, which would include the operating fee that comes after that. It would include the inventory requirement. So you may be reporting an inventory for a facility that you just purchased and you weren't operating during that time frame. So you need to get the data from the prior owner so that you can report that inventory. Here's what that change of ownership form looks like, the 100-883. It has information on the left for the previous owner to fill out their information, and then the new owner fills out their information on the right. Both parties need to sign it. Something I do want to stress is to do things properly, please send in the form. Do not try to get around it by doing something else, such as updating the facility status to temporarily or permanently shut down. That is not the correct way to do things, and that makes our data messy. So please just follow the traditional method of filling out the form. And if you do not hear from us after submitting the form, please reach out to us and make sure that we received it, because we should be following up with you after we've processed it to let you know that we've processed it. And then just a last comment on this, that it would be nice if you shared your operational data with the new owner so that the new owner can submit an accurate inventory. And I've already mentioned that the new owner assumes liability for payment of the fees and emission inventory reporting. Another reminder is you can go into Slice at any time during the year and see your previously submitted reports. You can download those for your records if you need. You can amend a prior report. And to do that, you just need to log in and navigate to that facility, and then navigate to the annual report you're wanting to amend. And on the right-hand side of the screen, there is an option to request to amend. And please give us a decent explanation of why you're wanting to amend, whether it is due to an inspection or enforcement case, or you just noticed some type of error, please give us some details around that, especially if you are adding new equipment that you forgot to report, because we'll want to ensure that we carry out the correct unique identifier throughout the annual reports. So we'll want to sync that up in all years that are amended. Now getting into SLICE. SLICE stands for State and Local Emissions Inventory System, by the way. It is utilized by over a dozen state and local agencies throughout the country, and we've had it for a couple years now. We've gotten good feedback on it. We're pretty happy with it. So I'll go over a reminder and then get into some updates, which I think a lot of you are probably waiting on. So we have gotten calls over the last couple of years about people having trouble logging into SLICE, and what we've realized it is that they're on some other state's SLICE webpage. So be sure that you are on Oklahoma's. You can see that by the OK in the web address or our logo on the top left-hand side of the homepage. The first paragraph, we also bolded Oklahoma. The bad thing about this is that we can't tell the other states what to do. And so some of the other states have not tried to put their name out there, and it won't be super noticeable unless maybe you look at the web address that it is, that state. This is something we're targeting for an improvement, but right now this is what we're dealing with. So if you're having trouble logging in, this may be the first thing to look at. So some reporting changes for your 2021 inventories, and I'll go into more detail on each of these in the upcoming slides. But one is the NAICS, the North American Industry Classification System. There's been a change on how we're collecting the NAICS codes. And then the status date fields have changed to a year field. And the last or final emissions year at the process has changed to a process operating status and year field. There's been some changes to release point types. And as Joe already mentioned, calculating the produced water emissions. So on the NAICS code, now previously you could only enter one NAICS code for your facility. Now that has been opened up, and this is something that has come from EPA that has then been implemented into SLICE. They are collecting more than one NAICS code for a facility, but you do need to indicate which one is the primary code. Another improvement is it used to be in SLICE that the status had a calendar instead of the year. It had, you have to select your month, day, and year that you went to that status, which was very confusing because then that's not how we handled the data, and that's not how we submitted it to EPA. EPA works on an annual basis, and that's how we work with the inventories. So that status has to be that status for the entire year. So the month and day didn't make any sense. So that has been changed, and that is at all levels in SLICE. That's the facility status, emission unit, release point, control device status. And the year field is required if you're changing the status to permanently shut down or temporarily shut down. And if you don't fill that out, it will give you a validation error. There's no status year required for operating. So if you have operating, then that can be null. Another improvement to SLICE is, so as I mentioned, they went from the month and day to a year, but they also had we had a last or final emissions year at the process level, well, that has changed to kind of align with everywhere else in SLICE. So at the process, you have an operating status field and a status year field. And we did pre-populate these values for you based on the emission unit information and whether you had this field already filled out. Again, a year is required if the status is not operating. Another change to SLICE is there's a new release point type called a low flow vent. It has the same requirements as other non-fugitive release points. And there is a new release point stack shape. We had circular, which the requirements for that are stack diameter, as well as the other release stack parameters. But for the new shape rectangular, you'll need to provide the stack opening length and the stack opening width. The fifth update I want to talk about is the produced water emissions. As Joe spoke on it earlier, it's no longer appropriate to use the 1% of oil for produced water working and breathing emissions. So please utilize the new AP42 information. And some of you may have already done this in your reporting for last year. I know we got some questions on it last year, and we did tell people to utilize the new AP42 methods. I think produced water in particular was maybe overlooked, but please start utilizing this with your 2021 inventories for sure. Quality control. One of our biggest QC issues on last year's inventories was dealing with inconsistent statuses. So I want to talk about that. The status options are operating, temporarily shut down, permanently shut down, or at the facility level only, you'll see not yet built. So you'll see these three everywhere throughout SLICE. And operating, just a reminder, means that that facility or that emission unit, that process, whatever it was, operated for any part of the calendar year. So I want to go into a bit more detail on temporarily shut down and permanently shut down. So at the facility level, temporarily shut down means the facility was idle for the entire year. It did not operate at all that year. The permit is still active and the facility may restart at any time. And the key here that we ran into with QC is that all of the lower data elements, the emission unit, the process, all of that stuff must have a status of temporarily shut down or permanently shut down. So please take the extra step to do that for the equipment and whatnot. So for permanently closed, that means the facility did not operate for the entire year and it will no longer operate. The permit has been canceled, or you're wanting to cancel the permit with that, and you're sending in notice at the same time that you want to cancel the permit. There will be no more inventory reports after this one, and you have set all of the lower data elements to permanently shut down. Steps for changing a facility to temporarily or permanently shut down are listed here. You need to change the status and enter the year field. And if you don't enter something in the year field, you'll get a validation error. Of note that if there is something already entered in the year field, say you had a temporarily shut down facility, from a couple years ago, and now you're wanting to permanently shut it down and cancel the permit. Well, SLICE doesn't wipe out that year field for you right now. We are looking at an enhancement in the future to clean that up, but it will still retain the data that you put in that year before. So if you change the status to permanently shut down, you need to overwrite what you had in the year field and make sure that's correct. And then I recommend that you change all of the lower data elements in consecutive order, from release point to control device to emission unit and the processes. Make sure you enter status and a year for those. And when you're looking at changing the equipment or any of these other elements to temporarily or permanently shut down, keep in mind that temporarily shut down unit means it did not operate at all during the year, but it may restart at some time, versus permanently shut down unit, it will be dropped from the following inventory year. And if you're wondering how to navigate around and identify all of the related records for your shutdown equipment, you can go to on the emission units page. You can find under related unit processes, you can find that process. And then on the unit processes page, you can, under the release point apportionment tab, you can find the associated release point. And also under the unit processes, under the control approach tab, you can find the associated control devices. So be sure to update those statuses and years as well. What we do not want to see, what we do not want you to do is try just to zero out the throughput, zero out the emissions instead of updating the statuses when something is shut down. If you do it properly and update the statuses, then when you navigate to, say you update the facility to temporarily shut down, then you navigate to, and you go through all the steps. And if you click on the process emissions, you won't find any records in there because there's nothing to report once you properly update everything to shut down. The emission records are not available. So if you update, say, one emission unit to temporarily shut down, then those associated emission records just for that emission unit will not be available. Unfortunately, you cannot use the template files to update statuses. That's not part of it. So you do need to update the statuses prior to downloading the templates. A heads up for 2022 reporting for the forward, for our future, or sorry, I was getting ahead of myself. This is for, yes, this is for the future. Sorry. There has been an additional HAP that EPA has listed. So on December 22nd of last year, just last month, the EPA administrator signed a notice adding 1-bromo-propane, also known as 1BP, to the Clean Air Act's list of HAPs. The effective date is February 4th, 2022. This is the first time EPA has added a pollutant to the HAP list since Congress created the list through the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. 1BP is used in dry cleaning, solvent degreasing, adhesives, furniture foam fabrication, and other applications in aerospace industry. So we are expecting that 1BP emissions will be collected currently this calendar year and then reported for your 2022 inventories. So that's why I got confused. This is a now thing, but it's also a future reporting thing. And the future of SLICE, we have received an EPA grant to make some improvements to SLICE, and some of those improvements that we're targeting. One is this first bullet item is for us. It's a bulk operation to assist us in processing your reports. Currently, we have to process a single facility report at a time, and that's not a real good use of our time. We would like to be able to bring more reports into our environment at a time so then we can really get started on quality control. And then the next bullet item, this is for you guys. You guys have been requesting this for years, a copy and paste feature in which you could copy like an emission unit and its associated records within a facility or from one facility to the next. So if you had, say, a new facility and you had 5 emergency engines, they were all the same, you could build one out in SLICE and then you could copy and paste that multiple times. Or if you had, if you owned multiple facilities and they have the same equipment and they're new, you could once you build one out, you could copy all of that out and paste it to another facility. Another thing we are targeting, as I mentioned, that we've gotten many calls on somebody being on the wrong SLICE page for somebody else's state. So we're looking at having some branding on the SLICE homepage. And another enhancement would be a total emissions by facility report for multiple facilities. We are also looking into streamlining the process for closed facilities to verify that they want to terminate their air permits. If you have been reporting inventories for many years, you might remember when we had Redbud, our previous system, that you could change the status of the facility to permanently shut down, and some language would pre-populate in the facility notes that said you were certifying that you wanted to close the facility and you wanted to cancel the permit. SLICE doesn't have anything like that right now, and we would like to move towards that to where it reduces the burden for you guys to communicate with us in multiple ways. And we'll be looking at multiple quality assurance, quality control items to put into SLICE. So that is the end of my presentation, and I can take questions now.
So we've had a few questions in the chat. Some of them have already been answered, but I'll go ahead and read out some. So Sean asked, which web browsers does SLICE work in? And Grant replied, SLICE works with all major browsers. I personally prefer Chrome. Internet Explorer is not recommended. And then Sean asked about Safari, and Grant said, yes, Safari works as well. And then Sean Walker asked, does it automatically set the previous NAICS code as primary, or do we need to set it for all facilities again? And Grant responded, yes, the existing NAICS code was set to primary. No need to make the selection again. You only need to make a selection for new facilities to make a change to the existing code or to add an additional code.
I like that Grant is answering these questions for me.
No, this next one I don't believe was answered. So from Pamela Sanchez, if a facility had a change in ownership and the forms were not submitted within the 30-day transfer time, is there a fine associated with that?
That's a good question. That's not my area of expertise because that gets into violations and penalties. I would have to defer that to Rick, and he can follow up with you through email. I'll grab your email off of the registration so we can answer that.
All right. And then the next question from Brandy asked, what release point type should be used for tanks? And Grant responded, we typically recommend a fugitive release point for tanks. The length and width of the release point should be the length and width of all of the tanks that share a common header, i.e. the tank battery. And then Brandy asked, so the entire area of the tanks, not just the length and width of the tank vent? And let's see, oh, Grant said, Brandy, yes, the length and the width of the tanks. Here is a guidance document, though it is a little light on the specifications for the release point. So Grant dropped a link to that guidance document in the chat. And then let's see. So then Bill Williams asked if an operation that has been temporarily shut down for an extended period, i.e. more than over 12 months, and the decision to start up or end has not yet been made, how would you recommend this be reported? That has not been answered.
I would continue to report that as temporarily shut down. So you'll see that every year in your inventory, and you'll have to account for it. You'll have to answer for it every time. But yeah, if you haven't made the decision to get rid of that, I'm not sure if you're exactly talking about a facility or maybe just one piece of equipment. But either way, even if it's a facility, you don't want to cancel your permit yet, you're not ready to do that, then just know that you'll need to file an inventory every year, and unless you're under the permit by rule. But I would continue to do the temporarily shut down. There is no maybe this is taking the question a bit too far, but there is no expiration, so to speak, on temporarily shut down status. You can have something temporarily shut down for many years.
Great. So we've got a hand raised from Kristen Rule. I will get your line unmuted and you can ask your question.
Hello. I'm in the process of updating a very outdated permit. It's in peer review right now, and I'm not sure if I'll receive it before the reporting deadline. How should I accurately report my emissions for 2021?
So the facility has been operating for how long?
Yeah, decades.
Okay. So what are the changes in this new permit?
There'll be some new emission points and some new pollutants.
Okay. And those are operating? Those operated
Yes.
for 2021?
Correct.
Okay. Then those definitely need to be reported. And
should I just manually add the pollution sources even if I haven't received my permit?
Yes. I know some other states, their permitting system is like tied in with their inventory reporting, but here in Oklahoma, that is not the case. So we don't go and grab your new units from your permit or anything like that. It is expected that the facility create those new units. So yes,
okay.
You would add those in Slice and add the new pollutants.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we've got another question in the chat from Sunny Massey, who asks, I manage one of OKC water treatment plants. Does any of these new rules and regulations pertain to on-site generators?
I think that may be a question not in emissions inventory, or does any of these new rules and regulations pertain to on-site generators? Can they clarify on that?
Yeah, Sunny, if you want to raise your hand and talk. All right, there you are. I'm going to get you unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the Draper treatment plant has three 2.7 megabyte generators that will run the whole facility in case of a power outage. That's the only reason. The only reporting that I do for any emissions control is because of this generator system. But based on the presentation, it looked more like this was more toward the oil and gas industry. So I was just trying to verify to make sure I didn't miss anything that will be a requirement for when I do my reporting.
So all of the changes I mentioned in Slice, like, I mean, your NAICS code is probably the same. The year fields moving from a month and day to a year on the statuses, you'll notice that, and that would affect you just as anybody else. I'm trying to think what else. That I went through. If you're wanting to shut down any equipment, you would need to follow what I said. The produced water emissions, that was specific to oil and gas for sure.
And I don't necessarily mean your slide, I mean the entire presentation.
Oh, okay, like the whole workshop.
Yes.
Did any of the other presenters want to say anything specific on this?
I mean, if there is, I'm sure I'll be able to find them when I go in and start filling everything out. I just wanted to make sure if there was, a certain area that, yes, this pertains to you, make sure you don't skip it or whatever. I just kind of wanted to have my ducks in a row.
Mm-hmm. I don't see any. Well, yep, I see some of the permitting managers unmuting.
Yeah, Carrie, I can answer for permitting. We didn't really cover existing rules that or any new rules that affect those types of units. Those types of units are there's a couple NSPS NESHAP rules that affects that equipment, and for permitting purposes, if that equipment was constructed, modified, reconstructed based on the way our rules are stated, there could be a permit requirement. And we permit tons and tons of emergency generators around the state because of the way our rules are currently worded. And so I don't know the status of the facility there, or if this triggers. We do have some guidance on our website on the permitting side. If you're interested in that, or you can reach out directly to us if you need assistance in determining the permit status for the facility. So anyway, that's the update from the permitting section.
Okay, thank you.
All right, if that concludes that question, I'll move on. We've got a few more. Next up is Jacob Post, who's got their hand raised. I'm going to get you unmuted and you can ask your question. And you may also need to unmute on your end. All right, Jacob, I'm still not hearing you. Do you want to try to unmute? All right, I'm going to move on to the next question and I'll come back and try to see if Jacob's got a question. So this next one's from J.R. Heimer, who asks, if we had an operating permit pulled into our Title V permit, do we need to submit a form that this facility/building permit is terminated, or is that done automatically by the permitting engineer at DEQ?
I'm not seeing that question. Did that get sent
This
to
was a
you specifically?
direct message to me, yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was scrolling through trying to find
No,
it.
it's all good.
Can you read it one more time?
Sure. If we had an operating permit pulled into our Title V permit, do we need to submit a form that this facility/building permit is terminated, or is that done automatically by the permitting engineer at DEQ?
So this sounds like, two facilities are turning into one facility, and I would say that we at DEQ will identify that and close the old facility out. If you get into Slice and you don't see that that's the case, please reach out to us. But we do try to stay on top of those and make sure you're not like double reporting equipment.
All right, and I copied that question into the chat, so everyone should be able to see that question now.
Okay.
All right, are there any other questions? Excuse me.
Actually, it looks like somebody direct messaged me as well. Hopefully I didn't miss any. I see one now. Hopefully I didn't miss any others that they did this. Caitlin says, for QA or QC purposes, what is the allowable difference between TRI and AE, which I'm assuming is emission inventory reports? We ran into an issue last year where the TRI and emission inventory reports had different calculations that caused differences between reports. Interesting, different calculations. So we really don't want to see any difference between the air portion of the TRI and the emission inventory that you're reporting to us. And we do get flags on this every year from EPA. They'll send them back down to us, because you're reporting the TRI to EPA. And where there's differences, we look into those. Usually it means we have seen the results that we're collecting better data in the emission inventory. And I know TRI in the past has had the ability to report like a range, which can mess things up when you're trying to compare emission amounts between one and the other. But different calculations, that's interesting. I would like to know more about that, Caitlin. If you could email me, I'd like to know more about these different calculations, because in my eyes, I'm thinking we shouldn't see any difference in these air emissions.
Great, and if you could copy that question into the chat so other folks can see. We've got a question from Bill Williams. It says, hello again, how may I be added to an email list for any future events like this? And Malcolm replied, this is the place to sign up for all our public email and text notifications, and provided a link to our website.
Hi, this is Malcolm. I just want to follow up that we did have a workshop mailing list, but that was not public at this time. We were just populating it directly. We'll look into if we want to make that a public sign up too.
Thanks, Malcolm. All right, are there any other questions at this time? I'm not seeing any new messages or hands raised, but we will wait here a few more seconds just to see if any pop up. All right, Carrie, I'm not seeing any more questions.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for attending. This has been a great turnout, which I'm real happy about because I convinced all these presenters to put on presentations with us. If you do have any further questions, feel free to call or email us. And we have recorded this workshop, so it will be posted to that workshop page. And all of our PowerPoint presentations are on that workshop page as well, if you want to download those. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.